morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started with our Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee work session for review of Expedited Bill 2519, Contracts and Procurement, Local Business Preference Program established. I also want to remind everyone that we have deferred the OPIT liability discussion, but we will be scheduling that very soon. Expedited Bill 2519 was introduced on September 17th, 2019 by me acting as Council President on behalf of the County Executive. We did hold a public hearing on October 15th. We had 5 speakers. We did wait a little bit to have this particular work session because there were some questions that we wanted to have clarification by the county executive and the administration. And so the moment that we received those answers, we went ahead and scheduled this particular meeting. I want to say that, last year in particular, with the start of a new administration as well as a new council, we here on the county council have been working diligently to send a message that we're on record in supporting whatever measures we can support to promote economic development, and the executive has also committed to that type of action. We did adopt an economic development platform, and this particular bill fits very nicely within one of the quadrants, which is to promote business development, expansion, and retention. And so I think it's really wonderful that we can all work together in a very strategic framework to promote economic development, but also I think that this kind of deliberative approach allows us to then measure the impact versus just having different, activities and different initiatives. And I find that to be really important. We also, I just want to also say that I know all of us met with different business groups that came and expressed their support for this particular bill. So I do appreciate all the small business owners that have been involved in this, as well as, of course, our chambers, who have been so important in being partners as we work through all these different measures. This is, again, one more, but we have already been pretty busy working on a lot of them, and there will be definitely more to come. So with that, I do want to welcome Procurement Director Ash Shetty, and of course Ms. Deno, who we know very well, and I assume you are Megan Green. Welcome. Appreciate you being here. So Mr. Drummer, if you could then walk us through the packet, and again, thank you, Mr. Drummer, for all your work. We have actually done some similar work in the past. It wasn't exactly this bill, but we had worked on reciprocal preferences and things of that nature. So Mr. Drummer is not a stranger to these types of bills, and once again has prepared a really important packet for us. So Mr. Drummer, walk us through.
Good morning, and I do want to just thank the Procurement Office for answering our questions and providing me with a lot of information that I asked for. They've been very helpful in this. This bill, just to explain briefly what this bill does, it would create a 10% preference both in contracts awarded by competitive sealed bidding, and by that I mean contracts that are put out for bid and are decided completely on responsible bidders who have the lowest price. So if you qualify to do the work, you offer to do the work that was asked for, and you've got the lowest price, it's your job. And this would provide a 10% preference for local business. In other words, if a local business bids $100,000 on a job and the non-local business bids $91,000 on the job, who would be the low bidder, we would give the job to the local bidder, and we would assume that for purposes of comparison that their bid was $90,000, but of course they would get paid $100,000. So the county would then pony up $9,000 more than they would have had they just taken the low bid. It also requires a 10% factor, evaluation factor for local businesses in requests for proposals. Requests for proposals are a different way of soliciting for a contract in which you set up several factors, usually 5 or 6 factors, that you're going to consider, and price is not it's just one of the factors, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be any of the factors. You could be negotiating a price afterwards. The factors are usually with experience, qualifications, trying to pick the person or the company that you believe will do the best job. Price is usually a factor, one of the factors. This bill would require a 10% of the points to be awarded on being a local business. And it's been stated that that's similar to what we do for minority-owned businesses, but not really. For minority-owned businesses, we have a point factor for participation by minority-owned businesses. But if you're not a minority-owned business, you can still get some of those points by providing a certain amount of subcontracting to minority-owned businesses. So you're not shut out completely. And a minority-owned business that doesn't subcontract may actually get less points than a non-minority-owned business who does subcontract an amount of work to minority-owned businesses. So this would be a straight, you're either local or you're not, and you're going to get 10% of the points, which would probably make a big difference in a lot of evaluations. There's been, procurement provided some statistics on what would have happened in competitive sealed bidding in the last 2 years. How many contracts would have been flipped because of this, and how much would it have cost us? And that's in the fiscal impact statement. For FY18, it's 13 contracts would have been flipped. It would have cost the county an extra $655,000. In FY19, 13 contracts would have been flipped, but it would only have cost us $58,942. They didn't have any statistics, procurement doesn't have any statistics on what contracts would have been flipped under RFPs, so we don't really know. The other thing to point out is that the 10% on competitive sealed bidding, there's no cap. So a $40 million contract, 10% would be $4 million, $100,000 contract, obviously much less. Let me just say this too. There's been some statements made that, well, everyone else is doing it, we need to join the group. That's not really true. The District of Columbia government is doing it, but their percentages are lower for local residents in most cases. I think it's 2% for being local, get extra points for small. I provided a chart in there that shows you what the district does in the packet. Prince George's County, and I can't say this enough, does not do this for competitive sealed bids. They do it only for requests for proposals. Baltimore, and then Mr. Shetty mentioned Baltimore City's program in the response to questions, but that appears to be similar to our local small business program. It requires you to be small as well. This one has not got anything to do with size. This is just whether you're local or not. There are some legal issues that are addressed in the packet. The county attorney's office raised some legal issues with this. They had raised some legal issues when the council added the local requirement to the local small business reserve program and made it local small business instead of just a small business reserve program. And they're raising the same issues here. The biggest issues, and I'm not going to go through all of them, the biggest issues is the privileges and immunities clause, which is essentially part of in the U.S. Constitution, is to discourage discrimination against residents of another state due to their residence. The courts have held that, well, there are instances where you can do that, and you must show a substantial reason for doing this. And that's something the county attorney's office has pointed out. You need to make sure that you can prove that there's a substantial reason for this. And as we go on, you can make your own judgment whether you think we've got that or not. The other one is a potential argument with state preemption. As Chair Navarro mentioned, in 2015, we enacted a law that required a local preference for a business in a competition where the low bidder was a non-local business that came from a jurisdiction that had a local preference. In other words, it's if you're going to do it to us, we're going to do it to you. That's very similar to what the state law is. There's a state law that says if you're a non-resident, and what they call a non-resident bidder is somebody not in the state of Maryland. I mean, obviously it's not limited to just a particular county. And there's a preference from where the non-resident bidder comes from, then you would, the state would then provide the same kind of local preference. And it provides an interesting provision because it says in there, when a political subdivision or an instrumentality of government in the state uses competitive bidding to award a procurement contract, the political subdivision or instrumentality may give a preference to the resident bidder who submits the lowest responsive bid of any resident bidder if the resident bidder is a responsible bidder, the responsible non-resident bidder submits the lowest responsive bid of all bidders, and the state in which the non-resident bidder's principal office is located gives a preference to its residents. In other words, it gives you, this statute tells you when we can provide a local preference in these circumstances. There's no court decisions, directly on point challenging this type of local resident preference in a county. So I can't tell you what the courts are going to do for sure. I know the county attorney's office has looked at this issue and they believe that this is not preemption, that there's not an attempt to preempt the field. I will just point out one thing. There is a line of cases, and there's a Latin term for it, and I'm not good with Latin. I think I missed that class in law school. But
Read it, you don't have to speak it in law school.
But here goes.
Catholics.
They use the term expressio unius est exclusio alterius. What that means is when the legislature in a statute expressly authorizes a particular action under certain circumstances, the statute ordinarily should be construed as not allowing the action under other circumstances. So it's saying, if the legislature says you can do this under these circumstances, it means you can't do this under other circumstances. That's a general rule of law. It's a statutory, construction rule. It's not always followed. Rules of statutory construction in court cases vary, but there is that line of cases. I can't tell you that this is preempted, that we can't do this. But I think there's certainly a potential for that kind of challenge. And the courts have not really looked at the situation, the Maryland courts, where a county government is discriminating against other Maryland companies from other jurisdictions in the state. It's unclear how they would look at that. Moving on from the legal issues, because I'm not telling you that this is illegal and you can't do it. I'm just telling you there are issues. It could be challenged. I can't tell you exactly how it's going to come out.
So can we just pause here for a second?
Sure.
That's because these are very important points. Because I want to ask Mr. Shetty, as the county executive, and of course, as you prepared this particular proposal, can you tell us how all of these elements were considered and weighed? Obviously, we do want to make sure that we're doing everything we can But of course, when you hear things like, could this actually not be something that would benefit minority businesses? That raises a red flag. These different elements of the legal issues. How did you guys approach those, and what was the thought process around? I think we're good. We won't have any problems. And then the other piece is this notion of what other jurisdictions are doing. It certainly is different than other jurisdictions, right? DC one is very interesting in terms of the elements that it includes. Prince George's has a different approach, et cetera. So just curious to see if there was, any kind of consideration of those other particular programs and their structure to avoid maybe some of the legal possible ramifications around the discrimination piece of of other folks from other jurisdictions. So I'm just curious about how you ended up with this particular proposal, and then the vetting process around that, and then we'll get to the other issues.
Sure, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. If I cough or sneeze at some point, it is because I have seasonal allergies.
Me too.
I don't want to be cleared because I suddenly had a coughing fit.
Thanks for the warning.
Yes.
So, and thank you for those questions, and thank you, Mr. Drummer, for working with our office, for asking lots of detailed questions, and I was, glad to be able to have some of these conversations preemptively. From this first set of questions that we're discussing, I've gathered or captured three. Tell me if I've missed any. The first is around other jurisdictions that have similar but different laws. The second is around how this might affect our minority, female, disabled vendors. And the third is around the legality of it, which is probably one of the more interesting ones, and why I wanted Megan sitting next to me, not behind me. Mm-hmm. And so let me start with the other jurisdictions. Look, you have various reasons for how things get put together based on the dynamics of a council or the bureaucrats who put ideas forward. We spoke at length, especially with Washington, D.C., because theirs was a very interesting system. To note, they have no minority, female, disabled criteria in there. It is just various forms of local, including the majority of their points, I believe, are allocated for being a long-term DC based resident here. So it's this and that's, I think, 8 points, if I'm not mistaken, 10 points for that. And so the way they've set it up, to be honest with you, is confusing. It's not, I can't remember it, even though I've been trying to remember it. And a lot of the feedback we got is those types of things that make you feel like you're doing Sudoku to get up to 12%, which is what their max is just, it's very complicated. Prince George's County has done something similar where you can get up to 15%, but you get like only 2% if you're a franchisee, not really a locally based company, versus you get like 5%. If for various criteria, they'll throw something at you. If your owner lives here, but the business, all sorts of different criteria. What I learned, and we heard Council President Katz and I through the 4 business forums, is that the more we complicate things, the more it's off-putting for businesses. Even our local small business reserve program, there was a lot of just criticism around the fact that it was hard to understand what is included or what is not. So I'm local, do I get this? No, because it's not set aside. And that was just frustrating to folks. So the criteria I honestly went with, based on feedback from those sessions, was this needs to be kept simple, but there needs to be something, because there was a very audible demand for it that we weren't doing it. And so one of the criteria was the simplicity, and that's why the 10%. I wanted to have one number, not some form of mathematics that would have a spreadsheet would be needed to figure out what you get. It also is efficiency on our part, by the way, because then we don't have to do more fact finding. So how long have you lived here? Can you show me the length of your residency in et cetera? The other aspect of it was understanding the fact that there is this very, very strong and arguably true perception that the cost of doing business in this county is greater because of the various different, the higher minimum wage that I'm sure you'll hear people complain to you about from time to time, this idea that they feel that real estate here costs them more, that permitting has other criteria that sometimes is cost prohibitive. So we wanted to give local businesses a meaningful enough percentage, a number that allows them to feel like, okay, I understand it, it's 10%, and it's substantial enough that it makes me feel like Montgomery County is doing something to level the playing field for me when it comes to doing contracts directly with them, right? But so the reason I bring up the reason for choosing 10% is because I want you to understand that we wanted to be competitive with other jurisdictions that right now are wooing our businesses away by telling them, hey, it's cheaper for you to be with us. And by the way, you can still apply for those Montgomery County contracts. There's nothing that would prevent you from doing that, but at least in our jurisdiction, we'll give you something for being based here. This now changes that argument. They can no longer say that. Montgomery County hopefully will also recognize the fact that you're a local business, and that would prevent some businesses from sort of fleeing. I can speak more to that first question around the different jurisdictions, but I really wanted to save more time for the next one. And if you're okay with me moving to the next one, then I will. But if you have any questions on the other jurisdictions, happy to talk about that now. I can also, by the way, talk about the reciprocity law at some point. Maybe not now, but I would be happy to talk.
Why don't we move on to the other 2 points, and then I'll open it up for questions from my colleagues.
So now the minority female disabled one is definitely a policy question. As it stands today, Mr. Drummer said it correctly. If you are, and I'll say it more precisely, if you are a minority-owned business in our RFPs, our request for proposals, those score-based decision-making procurements, we set aside 5% for you just for being minority. It doesn't matter whether you plan to use minorities in your contract or not, because you are a minorities vendor, you get 5% of the points of that score, of that sheet. If, however, you choose to have a plan that fully incorporates minority-owned businesses in that particular job, you will get up to 10%. So you don't get 15%, you get 5 plus 5. Likewise, if you're a white-owned business and you applied with a full plan for having minority subs, you too would get 10%. But there is no circumstance under which a white-owned business can get just points for being white-owned business, whereas minority-owned companies will get that 5% just for being minority female disabled. What this law will do is, if you are local, you would actually get 10% just for being a local company. And by the way, we're keeping the local criteria pretty much identical to what we currently consider for local small, including the recent adjustment that even nonprofits will be considered local. So that stays. The only thing we're removing is the small criteria, which frankly reduces work on our end because we don't have to verify your size now, we just have to verify your address. If you are a local business, you get 10%. If you are a minority local business, you would get 15% just for being Montgomery County based. If the argument is that this hurts those businesses who are registered with us, who are minority owned, but currently based outside of Montgomery County, my rationale is this is actually an invitation for them. That if you come move your business to Montgomery County now, you will get 15% just for being a Montgomery County based minority business. Would it adversely impact a minority firm that is not based in our county? No, because we're not doing anything to reduce what we were giving them. The argument may be that now what they were getting, that 5%, somehow feels, and again it's feeling, not actual, less because somebody else is getting something. That is true, and again, like I said, but the solution is move here and you'll get both.
Can I pause there for a
Yes.
second? I assume that the argument, of course, is that minority businesses, just historically have had a lot of barriers to access, procurement and things of that nature, and therefore they always seem to be at a disadvantage, right? So I totally agree with your assertion that, this is a great way to then say, hey, Montgomery County is the place where you need to be. But they might argue, yeah, but those same issues of difficulty doing business in Montgomery County because it's, more costly or whatever disproportionately affects us even more. So what else are you doing to mitigate that impact for us? Have you had any conversations about that particular sort of issue?
Right. I have, what we've, again, our focus has been mostly with Montgomery County-based minority-owned businesses as well as white-owned businesses, but the feedback we've received overwhelmingly is that this definitely would help the local minority-owned businesses now disproportionately because, again, they will now get the 15%. As far as companies that are not based in, minority-owned companies that are not based in Montgomery County, none of them has actually approached my office proactively saying that this is a huge inconvenience or hardship for us, please stop doing it. I've never received a single bit of feedback.
About this bill, you mean?
Yes, lobbying me or
Well,
requesting me.
They'll start.
Sure.
They might say that in the future.
Right, and
Right now, they're-
and that's another consideration is the fact that we're working with OCA to put forward the next disparity study.
Yeah.
And so that is also another one of those things that is going to be an ongoing. Because remember, the disparity study is not about what we're spending in the local jurisdiction with minorities. It is about what we're spending in our supply chain, so to speak, with minority-owned businesses. But that is also something that may add something in the future in terms of consideration.
Okay.
But as it stands, the only feedback I received in public forums was very supporting from both minority-owned businesses as well as local. And then in terms of people who approached me, particularly the local minority chambers, who've all, I believe, communicated their strong enthusiastic support for this legislation as well.
Okay, and then,
Oh, the legality issue.
yeah.
So that's one of those things that, and again, I'll ask Megan to chime in here, but everything from the local small business reserve program to the recent expansion of its goal would technically invite some form of legal challenge, because we're basically, pushing on that same sort of area of law. As far as I don't know the right word, this is not a law, but the optics of it is, if at some point somebody were to bring this house of cards down, is everybody's trying different laws out to protect their local businesses, then in a weird way it creates a level playing field, but at least the story is that Montgomery County tried to do something for its businesses as opposed to sat on its hands till everybody else had it, and then there's nothing we could do. I would say that yes, there may be legal challenges to based on the things that Mr. Drummer said and based on some of the concerns that OCA had raised and has been raising for all of our other local laws. But the truth of it is nothing has been done so far. And in our case, we are really just sitting on our hands waiting for something to happen, but nothing's happening except we're falling behind.
Good morning, Megan Green from the Office of the County Attorney. I think that Mr. Drummer and Mr. Shetty both summed up the legal issues fairly well, which is basically we don't know. It could go, there is no direct precedent. There are certainly arguments to be made in a challenge for any type of program like this, and arguments to counter such a challenge. And as most lawyers know, two different courts could hear the case on the same day and decide two different ways. There's nothing directly on point. What we do know is that throughout the country, various jurisdictions have some form of local business preference, different percentage points, different structures to their programs. Some focus on industries. It's all very, very open. Our office was unable to find a case in which one of these programs was struck down at the appellate level, at least, which is the information we would have access to. And for another real lawyer answer, that may or may not be significant, the absence of any precedence on the matter. So that's really where we are.
Could I just add one thing to that? In order for something like this to get struck down, you need two things. One is you need a legal argument to attack it. That's already there for the local small business reserve program, essentially. Mm-hmm. But two, you need somebody who's angry enough to do it. What's the likelihood you get sued? I guess what I'm just cautioning is when you expand a program to the point where you're going to give somebody potentially, in a $40 million contract, you're going to take a bid that's $4 million higher than the low bidder, that bidder is going to sue you. People don't put together $40 million contracts and then you just walk away. Oh, well, I guess they're going to go run to a lawyer. So The local small business program doesn't really have that kind of effect on large contracts. So while the legal argument is the same, the likelihood you get sued, the more you do things like this. I mean, I've had that experience in my personal experience with minority-owned business programs, where, well, I don't need to go into that, but I mean, but it takes two things, and so the more you push it, the more likely you get sued.
Right.
But like I said, I agree with what Megan said is, lawyers can give you their opinions. I can tell you what I would do if I was the judge, but I'm not the judge. I'm not going to be the judge. It's going to ultimately.
You would.
Yeah, right. I mean, but, just realize that they're there, and that's just.
No, I appreciate that. I
Your
think that,
decision,
that's
that's all.
why it's important to have these, this deliberate sort of opportunity to go through every single element. Because obviously when we take this to full council, questions are going to be raised from other colleagues. So it's really important to make sure we've kind of like covered all the different issues. Let me turn to Council President Katz, and thank you so much, Ms. Green, for what you just described.
Well, first off, thank you all very, very much for all of your work on this, and I am supportive of the legislation. I think that this does, and as Mr. Shetty pointed out during the four business forums, we did hear time and time again, if you're going to try to help us, make it as simple as you possibly can, and I'm certainly there. I do have to say, though, and not that I'm trying to add any layers of complexity here, but I do think that I like the DC legislation, because if someone lives in the jurisdiction, then they get an additional preference. And to be very brutal here, we get their income tax, so a portion of their income tax. So that gives our jurisdiction an additional revenue source. So, there again, I'm supportive of the legislation. If my colleagues believe that this should be just the way it's written, I'm fine with that. If we believe that we should give an additional preference for someone that lives in Montgomery County, then I'm certainly supportive of that, and the percentages, can change. And then the only other question is to Mr. Drummers is whether or not there should be a cap on what the contract can be. I mean, I don't know how many $40 million contracts we have, but perhaps the $40 million contract should not be involved in this type of program. And I don't know whether $1 million is the right number. I mean, all these become arbitrary numbers, but I do believe that should be part of our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. I will only note that I thought the DC one was very interesting as well, but I think what you just described really speaks to me in terms of the complexity and how confusing a lot of these programs can be. And the other issue that I had to consider as chair was that, we did not discuss this during public hearing or anything like that. So to kind of change everything, I felt that, it may be important to stay put and kind of stay true to the bill. But, we'll work this.
I hear you. I do.
Yeah. Let's see, Councilmember Feetson.
Thank you to the chair, and I really appreciate your deliberative approach and thoughtfulness here. This is a complicated issue, and so I think it's important that we fleshed out some of these questions legally and otherwise. Some of them are operational, how we actually do it. I do have a little bit of a background working on a lot of procurements at the state level. This is not a new issue. This is not a unique issue. Every local business and every jurisdiction faces this frustration. Here I am paying my taxes. Here I am supporting our local community, and I do not get a benefit for that, and I pay the price for that, and that is frustrating, and I get that, and I appreciate that, and we have many local businesses here in the back who've been very involved in this. So I really appreciate that, and I just want to express all of our appreciation for everything that you do. These are the organizations, the companies, the businesses that employ our friends and neighbors who are actually supporting our Little League teams and doing the work in the local community with Rotary clubs and others. I just came from a Rotary Club meeting this morning, and I do think we need to do things to help these businesses. And so I also appreciate Mr. Shetty and Council President Katz and the work that you've been doing with the county executive on trying to do some outreach with these folks, hearing what their needs are. I think the thing we do the least and need to do the most is listen, and I don't think we've done that enough to our businesses. And I think the second thing we need to do is say thank you, because we don't do that nearly enough as well. It's asking what can the businesses do for us to provide the revenues that we need for the services, and not thanking them for the fact that we wouldn't be able to provide services without the risk that they take on a daily basis and the sacrifices that they make with their families and their employees on a daily basis. Chamber's also here. I want to thank the Chamber as well, and have had lots of conversations with them and the Montgomery County Small Business Association. I think it's really important to hear your voice and your advocacy for these local businesses. And Mr. Drummer, I appreciate the significant detail to which this packet addresses what is a very complicated issue. All I can say is you are not a judge, and if you were, I'd be nervous being in your courtroom. So, maybe you're a public interest judge. In the interest of the public, you're not serving as one for all of us, because I'd be nervous going before you. But I think as we talk about this question of legal challenge, this is always something that we face. This is not a new issue either, and we could do nothing almost always for the risk of what the legal ramifications might be, the hypothetical challenge that we face. And I'm a person who's very process oriented, as I have raised before, and I think we have to be thoughtful and deliberative, as I think the chair has really pushed us here. But we also have to make decisions. We also have to do things. We also have to pursue the public policy that we intend to pursue. And for me, I think through the fact that we have not been afraid as a county to place onerous requirements on businesses that raise all kinds of legal challenge questions and all kinds of state preemption questions, and we have not shied away from them for a minute. And for me, I have a real problem for us to use that as the rationale for not pursuing a policy that could actually help our local businesses, when in all the instances of putting requirements and placing onerous restrictions on businesses, that has seldom been a rationale used to stop it. And so, I appreciate all the comments that have been made. I also think the DC law is intriguing, but I do very much appreciate and share the views that Chair Navarro raised about the public hearing and the transparency of the process. And at a certain point, we have to make a decision, and I do think that keeping things as simple as possible is important. We have too much complication and too much requirements that are placed on businesses who are just trying to keep payroll. And I think, as we think about what's going on right now out in the world, outside these walls, frankly, inside these walls, and the challenges that are being placed on our businesses, I think anything that we can do to make it just a little bit easier for the businesses in our community that are going to be desperately struggling to stay in business, the nonprofit organizations that are canceling fundraisers as we speak. I think all of us have probably been texted and emailed multiple times just in the time that I've been blabbering on here, about another event that is no longer going to be happening, and the fiscal impact that that's going to have, not just on the nonprofit and their bottom line, but on the businesses that were providing the services to make that happen. I think that we need to be sensitive to it. So I am fully supportive of moving forward. I think there's a few things that we should flesh out to make sure that we address the issues that have been raised. I appreciate all of the thoughtfulness and the public and accountable process that we've gone through. I really appreciate the fact that we did take the time to have those questions answered, but I think we need to start sending messages that we are willing to take some risks to support our local businesses, and I think this would be an important first step in that conversation.
Thank you, Councilmember Friedson. Let me just recap where we are. I think that it's clear that the majority of the committee would like to stay with, I don't know if Councilmember Katz wants to join with the proposal, so we're good with that. I think we have heard the legal implications, which obviously we're a legislative body, so we obviously have to go through very carefully on whatever issues so that we can make informed decisions. I join the fact that I think we understand, but it is a policy call, and we've made those policy calls in the past. We have gotten sued, not in this particular policy area before, some other ones, and, we have stood our ground. But I think in this particular instance, having considered all the different legal ramifications, I think we feel very strongly that we're at an inflection point in the county, so it is important to do whatever we can to take some bold sort of decisions. And so if I'm reading my colleagues correctly, I think we have heard, we understand, but I think we would like to proceed. So with that, I think there may be a couple of other issues that we'd like to come back to, so I just wanted to put those aside. Council President Katz, on the issue of the cap, I think wanted to perhaps bring that up.
Thank you. And I did want to say that I agree with the concern about the public hearing process. As much as I like the idea that and I do like the idea that someone would get an additional preference if they lived in Montgomery County. I understand the public hearing process is an important one, and we didn't do it that way. So there again, maybe that's another day, another discussion. And also, I just want to say that I'm not afraid of the legal challenge either. If we don't pass this, then we'll never find out for sure about whether or not it happens. And at one point, I believe, I had the understanding that I think 1 in every 20 people in Montgomery County are attorneys. So more than likely, someone might have a discussion. But I do think we should get back to the cap discussion. Because I think, and Ash, what would you suggest should be a cap? I mean, what's a fair number?
So a couple of things there, and thank you for raising that, Council President Katz. One is, generally speaking, this vehicle, the invitation for bid, isn't used for very large, complex solicitations because by their very nature, they're things like construction that require an evaluation that takes it the RFP route. In other words, you should not come across very many contracts that are $40 million that are a straight bid, because that means we made a bad decision in determining that that's the vehicle we should be using. That said, you could occasionally run across like a concrete solicitation, which is going to be a commodity, so you could go this route. It's going to be a high dollar figure. And for that reason, I do agree that it is worthwhile to have a cap, so 10% or a certain number. Now, what you realize is when you put that number, you by default actually mean now it's a sliding scale for contracts beyond a certain value, right? So if I were to say the number is $200,000, then after that, the 10% starts becoming 8%, 4%, very quickly goes down to, minuscule amounts, but it protects the county's interest. I do agree, and I had actually spoken to you during our one-on-one conversation about this law, potentially about that being an amendment that would make a lot of sense. I think a number that would still allow us to protect the one thing that we should keep in mind also just about the language and the logic behind that premium that the county would pay is that it shouldn't be seen as a premium the county is paying just because we are giving business to a different vendor now. It should be seen as an investment we're making in our local community. In other words, that money is actually being spent locally. There's of the last 2 years, there is an example of a contract worth almost $4 million, which would have flipped for $130,000 to the local company. If we were to have created a cap of $100,000, then what would have happened is that a company that is not local would have taken that $4 million contract over $30,000. And then all that money gets spent elsewhere, maybe some part of it here, but by and large, we'd have lost it.
Right.
But when I did the analysis again, I found that at a cap of $200,000, only one such incident would have occurred where Montgomery County would have actually had to leave the low bidder with the award. But in like, I think 97% of the cases, Montgomery County businesses would have eventually won it. And again, keep in mind that I would never personally let a $40 million contract go the IFB route. So this shouldn't happen. It is also why I deliberately excluded e-auctions from this particular law for the same reason, because those tend to be commodities with very high dollar values. But when it comes to RFPs, this concern doesn't exist. There is no cap. When it comes to IFBs, based on the research we did, I think the $200,000 premium is a very reasonable sum, because it still doesn't alter the outcome from the business's perspective. It's not like we're just giving them a token. There's very few cases that exceeded that threshold, but at the same time, the county would never pay a premium of more than that sum of figure for some future solicitation someday. Hopefully that answers your question in a slightly long-winded way, but 200,000 is my recommendation.
So the cap would be $200,000 on a contract, or it'd be $200,000 differential?
On the premium, on the differential.
Okay,
And that would mean, yes, $2 million of.
$2 million contract.
The contract.
Okay.
So,
I'm fine. I mean, we're going to have a discussion, but I certainly take your analysis.
Can I just add a couple of things? One is, I think the cap really only is necessary for competitive sealed bids, because the RFPs are not really talking about prices. So we're just talking about competitive sealed bids. I think 200,000 is probably okay. I'm not, I'm okay with that. I wouldn't go with 10% on either competitive sealed bids or RFPs. As Mr. Shetty pointed out, a minority-owned business gets only 5% for being a minority-owned business, and then we're going to give a non-minority-owned business in an RFP situation 10% for just being local. I don't think that works well for your minority-owned businesses. I don't want to belabor the point, but just remember that 2/3 of the MFD businesses that are registered to do business with us are not local. So those are the ones that would be hurt by this. But beyond that, I think the 10% itself should be lowered. The 200,000 cap, I think, is fine. And I would recommend that you put a sunset provision on this bill to see how it's doing. Because if you don't, it's going to just stay in law without anybody thinking about it, and not going to know, did it really do what we wanted it to do? So, I suggested a 3-year sunset could be a different number of years, but I think there should be some sunset that would make the council and the executive actually really consider how has this done. And I just want to point this out before I forget. The effective date of the bill is January 1, 2020. That obviously needs to change. So before we leave today, we need to change that at the very least, okay? Because it can't be retroactive, and you probably need to give some leeway time. But.
yeah. Council President Katz, are you finished with that?
Yeah, I'm finished, yeah.
Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So a couple things. One, I appreciate that. I think the 200,000 cap makes sense. The way I was hearing it, and I think I was hearing two different things. I just want to be clear. The way you're talking about it in terms of creating the sliding scale where the 10% would effectively drop when it exceeds $2 million bid. I mean, I'm not great at math, but I'm good enough to figure that out. It would be 10% not to exceed a $200,000 discount, or $200,000, preference, right? That's what you're saying? Okay, I'm fine with that. I'm comfortable with that. I thought what we talked about earlier of the minority business, I just want to clarify, minority business for the purposes of those, watching this and for the record, is minority, women-owned, and disability-owned business, disabled-owned business, correct? Okay, I just wanted to make sure everybody understands when we say minority-owned businesses, that's what we're really talking about by our own statute. But I'm okay with the 10%. The way that we talked about it earlier, I just want to clarify this. A local qualified minority, disabled, or women-owned business would be additive, so it would be 15% preference.
No. In a competitive sealed bid, they get nothing. We're only talking, the cap only applies to competitive sealed bids, and MFDs get no preference, no point preference in a competitive sealed bid. They only get something in an RFP situation. So don't think that they're going to get 15%.
Does the scope of this bill allow us to change that aspect of this, or would that have to be separate legislation?
It would probably be tied to the minority female disabled, to that law, and it may be a separate change we make, but that law applies to the RFPs only.
Could you explain, I mean, is there a practical reason or a policy reason why we would not provide the same 5% for competitive sealed bids as we do for RFPs?
There's a legal reason.
Do you want to share it?
Yeah. The 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, race and gender are suspect classes, and you have to show not just a rational basis, but you have to show a compelling governmental interest that's narrowly tailored. That's the entire point of the disparity study, is to show a compelling governmental interest for making a distinction based on race or gender, and then it has to be narrowly tailored. There's a long line of federal cases starting in 1989 striking down minority-owned business programs for not having a compelling governmental interest or not narrow, and more importantly, and more likely, not narrowly tailoring the law to that, to remedy that past discrimination.
So
That's why, the local governments have been hammered since 1989, and state governments, for trying to do things like that, to limit contracts for minority-owned businesses, and I am using MFDs, minority female disabled businesses, and or to give them extra points for being an MFD. That stuff it's a much more complicated issue that gets you into the 14th Amendment and a lot of, my estimation, bad case law. If I was the judge, I don't think I would have gone that way, but
you're established. I'm glad you're not, but
but that is the case law, and very few minority-owned business programs, virtually none, that have done something like that have ever been upheld in the federal courts.
And
that's why we're not doing it.
And I don't want to get too bogged down on this but I do think it's important and related. Could you explain, based on the case law or your interpretation, the significant difference between an RFP standard versus a sealed competitive bid? Is that we can prove that an RFP you're disadvantaged as a minority-owned, a female-owned, or a disabled-owned business, but as a sealed competitive bid you're not, because we don't know who you are when it's reviewed? Or
it's got more to do with the point I made earlier, is likelihood of getting sued. People that get contracts on requests for proposals or evaluated bids know that they don't get jobs if the government that's looking at it is angry at them. This is a practical matter. They don't, first of all, they don't know exactly, it's not like a pure price thing where they can just point and say, I didn't get this job because of this. You didn't give it to the low bidder. And it's a much fuzzier type of case. And for the most part, people that bid on that,
you're saying it's less risky of being sued.
They know how to spell client, and they're not likely to do that. And it's not as draconian what we're doing for MFDs, because even a non-MFD firm can get that full 10% points by simply subcontracting to minority-owned businesses. So it's not at all comparable to just giving a minority-owned business a percentage boost, in a bid, in a competitive sealed bid. It's just that's why we don't do it.
Okay.
Yes, Ms. Green, Ms. Green, do you have anything to
sure.
add?
Thank you. No, that's okay.
I'm not familiar with the history of the MFD bill and why it was chosen RFPs versus IFBs. One thing that is possibly relevant is the competitive sealed bid, the IFBs, are pure price, whereas an RFP takes into account several factors to come up to a total score. It takes into account, the experience, the work history, the quality of the product or service being provided. And so the MFD factor, that 10%, is just one part of the score as opposed to the IFB, which just looks strictly at price. Mr. Drummer is correct that there's a difference in the way that the courts evaluate preferences based on race and gender as suspect classes versus a local preference. There's a different standard. There's the compelling interest standard for race and gender for any suspect classes. For non-suspect classes, which would be a local business, you have to have a substantial justification, which is a slightly lower legal standard for the viability of the law.
So, I appreciate that. And I think the fact price-based exclusively versus, a qualitative and quantitative through the RFP process, makes sense to me. And you can weight those, based on the type of RFP of how much is based on price and how much is based on, the other qualitative aspects. You have more tools in your toolbox, so to speak, from a procurement standpoint, which makes sense to me. I guess my view is we support our local businesses, so sue us. We support our minority, female, and disabled-owned businesses. At a certain point, I think we have to, do what we think is in the best interest of county residents and take the risk that we have, understanding the full weight of the decisions that we make. To the point earlier, Mr. Shetty, about, this isn't an advantage. You see it differently. I agree. I see this as a county reinvestment discount, which really is what this is about. You're reinvesting in the county with wages and with taxes and with other things. And so you should get, in accordance with that, a value based off of that and an understanding based off of that. The other points that were made on the sunset, I do think that we should be reassessing this, but I'd be more comfortable with the report. I don't know what the timing of that would be, if every year is too much, if 3 years is appropriate. I kind of yield to colleagues and to the department of what is reasonable and doable and what will give us enough data to actually understand what we're looking at.
The bill already has a reporting requirement in it.
It does.
Yeah, so I think in terms of timing, I'd be open to moving that around based on what people are comfortable. But, I think sending the message that, we feel strongly about businesses, but only strongly enough to maybe take it away after a short period of time. I'm not sure I love the message that sends. And so I would be comfortable, and with that, I'll yield to colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, that was my sense as well. I think that, it's important to put forth a message of certainty versus who knows if there's a different council, what happens. I mean, of course, things can change, but obviously, I think the fact that there is a reporting requirement. What is the reporting requirement timeline, Mr. Drummer? Did we say how many?
I think it's an annual report.
Annual, okay. I think that's
October 31st of each year. It's on page circle 4.
great. Yeah, and we do that for so many other bills that I think that would be sufficient. Council President, you have?
Yeah, and I'm in agreement with that. Candidly, even if we did a sunset for this, it would come back up. We would have a similar discussion, and more than likely, we would extend the sunset. And with the annual reports, if something is wrong, then we need to correct it as quickly as we can so that we're doing what we wanted this legislation to do. So I'm fine with no sunset.
Okay, I think that we have addressed all the issues in the packet. One
Effective
more?
date.
Effective date.
Effective date.
That's right.
Oh, really? You want to change that?
I do believe it's going to take a little more effort for procurement to certify larger businesses as local, because they're more likely to have offices both in the county and outside the county, which then leads you to the second part of the analysis in the regulation is, do you have 50% of your revenue coming from the county office or offices, or 50% of your employees working out of there? I think that's going to make it a little more complicated for procurement to do that. I think they probably need some time. I know the bill came over as expedited, would take effect immediately. I'm not really sure how they would gear up for that.
Well,
So
can you,
I would give them some time.
Yes.
respond to that?
And I appreciate the consideration. I think that is something that there's also an urgency, as Councilmember Friedson pointed out. the environment we're in right now with so much uncertainty, I think that there's a signal value to something like this. So I don't want to sit on it for too long saying that we're trying to get our ducks in a row. I was actually just asking Ms. Deno if she could provide a candid timeline on how quickly we can be ramped up to be able to certify. What she whispered to me is that we've already actually begun, out of just the support and the enthusiasm for this law, seeing an increase in uptick in the number of companies that have wanted to register as local. And so we might already have begun that process, so it may not be as bad as we think, but I'll let her speak.
So we actually already have a local business subcontracting program that requires us to certify local businesses,
Right.
not just local small business. So we already have the certification process there. We do need a little bit time to get our system all ready to enforce this law if this get passed. I would think if we start at the next fiscal year, July 1st, that would be possible to do.
Would that be your recommendation then?
Yeah, I mean, we want to make sure we do this right. We are already in mid-March right now. I think this last quarter, April, May, June, would give us the time to get everything in ready, maybe even knowing that this bill is in movement to get more businesses to sign up for it. I think that is a very safe timeline from our perspective.
So you can already begin to publicize it and do all of that,
start
and you feel that
registering folks.
date would be appropriate. Colleagues, what do you think about that one? Is that okay? Okay, so we are in agreement.
So I've got 3-0 for the bill with 2 amendments. One is to put in a cap for competitive sealed of $200,000. The language, I believe, is in the packet with a number of 100,000 that I would use. And
Something on that. I'm concerned that how we say that I don't want someone to believe, because we want to keep this as simple as possible, that the bid has to be less than $200,000.
I would say by reducing the bid prices by a factor of 10%, but not to exceed 100,000 or 200,000 for the purposes of evaluation and award only. So you're reducing. I mean, I think that does it.
To me, if we could put in there what the highest part of the bid would be, it would be simpler. I mean, if I was putting in, so it's a $2 million bid, right?
Well, no, because
No?
you may be within 10.
We want to allow for a $4 million bid and to reduce the percentage.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
That's where the sliding scale comes.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. That's fair. Yeah.
We don't want to
You
restrict.
want to limit the
Okay.
bid, you want to limit
that's good.
the extra bonus.
Right.
Okay, that's fair.
Okay.
And then we're changing the effective date to July 1, 2020.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so 3-0. Thank you so much
Good,
for all your
thank you.
work, and everybody has been monitoring this bill. We'll then now take it to the full council. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and we have moved the OPEB discussion to.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I had one other question. There was a couple businesses that raised the issue about the regulatory definition for what a permanent business is, and the question of the business's total number of employees versus total number of permanent employees. And the question being that if you have folks that are contractors, et cetera, do they count, what type of, depending on the type of business you are. My sense, I just wanted clarification. My sense of that is we're referencing a regulatory definition that already exists that's not included in this law.
So the way we are managing the local small business reserve program is to look at their FTEs and whichever employees they're reporting to the state on their quarterly unemployment insurance report. So that's how we count how many employees they have. So if they don't report their 1099 employees, for example, then they will not be counted.
Okay. Well,
We manage the LSBRP one, the local small business. So the definition here right now is mimicking what the LSBRP is.
based on what is reported by the business to the Department of Labor. Okay, thank you.
We're adjourned. Thank you.